Well, we hear a lot about Europe's debt crisis and the U.S. fiscal cliff weighing heavily on the minds of global financial leaders meeting in Tokyo earlier this month. Now, while leaders gathered at the IMF World Bank annual meeting did arrive at a consensus on long-term strategies for reform, there was far less agreement on how painful such policies should be in the near term. Well, here to help us make sense of it all and what it means for you and I, Dr. Martin Edwards, Associate Professor at the John C. Whitehead School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Thanks for coming back and joining us today.
You're welcome.
You know, it gets complicated. We try to explain IMF, World Bank, what it means, how it affects average folks. They come out of this meeting with Christine Lagarde saying, well, we're not out of the woods yet. Explain the big picture here and how it affects us here.
Well, the world economy is moving at sort of two different speeds right now. Okay, in the developed north, obviously we have concerns about the recovery in the U.S., the pace of the recovery in Europe, and then we have in the developing world, there's still a good amount of growth. People talk about China slowing down, but that slowdown isn't anything like what we're looking at in the U.S. We're looking at maybe in the worst case, China would still be growing at 5% this year. We wish we could have that sort of growth in the U.S.
And then you have other countries like Turkey, for example, growing, parts in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia doing well. And it's kind of, we hear this in the news over here in the U.S. and wonder, well, what's this whole uncertainty they talk about here in the U.S.?
Well, the uncertainty that we talk about with the U.S. is largely tied to the election. Okay, that we're trying to figure out what the shape of fiscal policy is going to look like. To what extent are U.S. policymakers going to resolve this thing that they call the fiscal cliff? And so businesses are trying to figure out, well, how much do I have to set aside for taxes next year? What do I have to worry about a payroll tax? So it's those sorts of decisions that are weighing on the minds of folks in the business community in the U.S. But obviously that doesn't ripple abroad to the same extent because they don't have this concern about who the election is, whether the election is going to change policies.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, as we read about this, we see how different countries impact other countries halfway around the world. China and Japan have this ongoing dispute over those islands. Now they're boycotting each other's products, but it's having a major effect in Europe and to a degree in the U.S.
No, absolutely. This was sort of one of the things that really limited what we could have actually achieved at this summit because China said, well, we're going to keep our diplomats at home, right? And Christine Lagarde was really critical of these guys, sort of like, she was sort of kind of like a referee, like, folks, there are too many issues at stake. We need to work on this. And this hurt the Chinese as well, because the Chinese are pushing for reform of the IMF. And, they can't voice their concerns if they're not in the room.
That's right, that's right. So as we look forward and we move out of this and all these world leaders come out and say, well, we're making headway. How does this translate to us here in the U.S.?
Well, it's really tricky. I mean, it's one of these things that folks would say, well, 15,000 people went to Tokyo and really nothing happened. And that's not an indictment of really summitry per se, because that's a common question I get, sort of, well, why do we have these meetings? But it's an indictment of the fact that times are really difficult and leaders have to respond to their own constituents and and also try to make choices that'll make other countries happy.
Let me ask you something that's happening right now. Ford is doing a downsizing over in Europe, talking about bringing jobs back here to America. That is a big switch in terms of what's been, compared to what's been happening over the last 10, 15 years.
Oh no, that's true.
How big does that loom when you teach your kids, your students, and you see this happening? Is this a big play?
I think so. I think that there's, we've seen lots of stuff written about sort of the resurgence of manufacturing in the U.S. And we've seen lots of stuff written about reverse outsourcing, right? That jobs are actually coming back to the U.S. because businesses really sort of do the math and they think over time, sure, the labor costs are more expensive in the U.S., but the uncertainty about where sort of where the economies are going is a little more a little more certain. So that makes repatriating to the U.S. a more sensible investment. So, that's obviously a good thing because we could certainly use jobs and we could certainly use high-paying manufacturing jobs.
Right, and we talked a couple of weeks ago, we had a guy on that represents businesses that do business overseas that were talking about, again, that uncertainty and maybe staying here in the U.S. I'm wondering, do you see more of that happening as looking forward?
I think certainly with Europe, because there's really, it's hard to see growth on the horizon in Europe. But it's not as if, again, because we're growing at different speeds, it's not as if China, Brazil, India aren't great places to invest right now. They absolutely are.
A lot in the headlines about Greece and Spain. Two big issues across Europe that we kind of look at from a distance and say, well, how's that affect us?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is tricky. The issues in Spain and Greece are both very complicated. But for our concern, what we want is both of these countries' economic crises to get resolved, because that will, restore Europe to positive growth and ultimately benefit us.
Because we're all interconnected.
I'm sorry?
We're all interconnected.
Without a doubt, yes.
Wow. Fascinating stuff, and it's always good to have you. We'll look to have you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.